But I'm here to talk to you about Enyo, our cross-platform, cross-browser JavaScript framework. And my name is Dave Freeman. I work on the developer relations team for WebOS and Enyo at HP. And there's my email address and my Twitter account if you guys want to follow me or ask me questions later on. Back there. Stand over here. Can everybody hear me all right? Yeah. Fantastic. All right, so nice little graphic, kind of squashes here. But again, it's our JavaScript framework for desktop and mobile app development. It's basically write it once and deploy anywhere. I stole that from Voice 7, another one of our developer relations engineers. Okay, I just wanted to start with a little bit of brief history about where we came from and how we got to where we are today. So back in 2009, some of you probably know of this company called Palm. Raise your hand. Palm is. All right, so back in 2009, they released a new smartphone called the Pre with a new operating system that wasn't Palm OS, it was called WebOS. And the idea was to allow web developers to create JavaScript and applications to run as, presented as cards in WebOS, basically native apps, or web apps as native apps. And there was some good things about Mojo. The number one good thing is that it taught me how to, made me learn actual JavaScript. Mojo was developed by a Java guy, so it was kind of, a little bit unwieldy, but it did teach me some really core JavaScript fundamentals about how to do the right things. As part of our Mojo effort and realizing that it wasn't quite as easy as we wanted it to be for web developers to use, we created a product called Aries, which was a web-based GUI builder, basically, for to keep it simple, where you could drag and drop components of various things, lists and scrollers, radial buttons, whatever, and then it would generate code for you and run as a Mojo application. All right. So what happened was HP purchased Palm in 2010, I believe that was. And they started making plans to release a tablet, the touchpad, the HP touchpad. And they found out that Mojo didn't really scale that well to the tablet to be able to stay and we wanted to come up with a better solution. And so what they did was they looked at the work that they had done with Aries. They had created this component model to do the magic that mapped these different GUI elements to Mojo code, and said, hey, this is a pretty cool thing, and we can use it as our development framework. So Enyo 1 evolved from the Aries project and basically replaced Mojo as the preferred inside of HP app framework for touchpad. Enyo 1 was closed source and would only work on the Widget platform, and it was on the touchpad in WebOS. Now that we've gone open source with Enyo 2, we've also open sourced the old Enyo 1. We just don't develop on it anymore. There may be some, if a critical bug fix needed to be done, I'm sure that would be done, but we're not, developing that tree anymore, but you can get it on GitHub as well. I think it is on GitHub, yeah, Kevin? All right. All right, so now that brings us to Enyo 2. We had a couple of bumps in the road last August. The death of WebOS has been greatly exaggerated. I'm happy to report that as of 3 weeks ago, we released version 1.0 of Open WebOS. And also during that time where we were trying to figure out how to stay alive, we said, hey, let's update Enyo as well and go with a cross-platform open source solution. So that's where we are now with Enyo 2. And it does run, across desktop platforms and mobile platforms. And on the desktop side, it's IE8 and higher, modern Mozilla, modern WebKit. And then on the mobile side, iOS, Android. We do need to deliver inside PhoneGap on those platforms, but they are still just web apps. You wrap PhoneGap around them and deploy them to those endpoints as well. So it's really great to have the one code base that you write your JavaScript application and be able to get it on all of these endpoints that exist today, right? With just single code base. All right, I kind of went through all of this, so I may skip through a couple of these slides. But we needed 500 apps for our touchpad release. That was the goal. So that was the, hey, Mojo isn't working out for us. We need to come up with this new solution, and Enyo 1 was born because of this. We want apps from devs that aren't experts, so we want to make it easy for the guys to create these applications. Not only just targeting seasoned web developers, but we want to bring new people in too, right? We want to get as many apps within our framework as possible across as many devices as we possibly can. And how do we do it? So the basic piece of what I think is the magic of Enyo is our component model. So, anybody that's done any kind of Visual Basic knows what components are, and we're mimicking that, where if you follow our encapsulation guidelines, our code is really modular. So you can write a component that doesn't know anything about his children, other than some methods and properties that it has, and knows nothing about his parents, and you can take that same component and put it in another place, or render it into a particular div in an existing web page. Right? It's very modular, highly customizable, and easy to use. Really good feedback now. Hey, I already said this one, cross-platform. All right, like I said, we're on GitHub, so you can go check out the Enyo JS organization. We have multiple projects out there, not just Enyo. We've got the libraries for layout and the Onyx widget set, the sampler app that I can show you all here in a little bit. Also, that's where Enyo 1 will be found. There's something else I was specifically going to call out. But you can go check out GitHub and see all the open source projects that we have. We do take pull requests, for things that people fix. If we say, yes, that's great, let's get it in. So we're actively pulling in contributions from the open source community. We love the open web standards. Let's see, oh yeah, Apache 2.0, everything's free. You can do whatever you want with it after you write your application. We don't have any restrictions on, your licensing. Okay, so there's a little bit of basic information. So we'll talk about some of the core here. And I kind of adapted this slide deck from our lead architect, Ben Cumby, so I'm kind of jumping around a couple places here. But first up, we have our package system. It's part of the boot piece of Enyo core. So this is how you tell Enyo what you want to load as far as your app goes, right? You can keep all of your components in separate JS files if you want to. You can include them all in one single JS file if that's better for you. But whatever you want to do to include them in your app, we run enyo.depends, and we put that in a file called package.js, right? And the framework will look for a package.js file and load up everything that you tell it that you depend on. So in this example, I'm just loading up a straight up app.js, a CSS file that would apply style to whatever controls I've created in there. And then that last one there is a little bit special, live Onyx. If you are using Enyo, you typically have an Enyo directory where the Enyo JS file is. And at the same level of Enyo as its siblings, you would have the lib directory. And inside lib, you put like our Onyx widget library or the layout library. And that $lib/Onyx just means look at the same place where Enyo JS was loaded and look for a lib directory from there and load a package.js. Oh yeah, that brings up the point. I'll just talk loud right here. So this is an example of a file. This is actually a directory. Now if you do this, if you want to include an entire directory of the source, then it also needs to have a package.js file in it that then says what it is it's going to load from that directory. All right, kernel, our OOP stuff. All right, so we have this concept of the kind. Oh yeah, sure.
I just got a question about the depends. Does it do that asynchronously, like all of them, or like let's say I have a couple that are dependent on each other in there? How does that work?
So it is asynchronous, yeah. But order is important because you can't. I've had a situation where I tried to reference a kind that was loading in package.js after my main kind that I was referencing it in. So you can run into kind of, I would say, a race condition or whatever, where it hasn't finished loading that kind yet, the definition for that kind, before you try to reference it, and it'll say, oh, I don't have a constructor for that kind. So you do kind of have to plan, in some cases, how my order of my package.js file is going to be.
So it loads it in the order in which you just.
Yes.
Okay. So if I have like foo and then I have foo.bar, foo.bar.foobar, it'll load those in that order.
Correct.
All right.
Yep. All right. So the kind, this is kind of like a class, but class is reserved in JavaScript, so we named it kind. And it's just a constructor factory. You pass it an object definition, and then you have access to make new objects of that type, new kinds is what we call them. And this should be an example of kind. This is Ben's example, I love it. So there you go, I'm passing this object definition to the Enyo kind method. I'm giving it a name of Firefly. It's extending another kind called television show. This is showing our ability to extend other kinds. We call that the super kind, all right? So the super kind is television show. We have a method, excuse me, for this kind called show that is going to run through and play this video file. But another special thing is this method called this.inherited that I'm passing my arguments array to. You use this whenever you have provided a method that is overriding a method of the superkind or somewhere up the hierarchy chain, and you want that same method from the superkind to run, you need to go ahead and run this.inherited arguments and pass the arguments to it so it will also run. There are certain cases where you may not want the superkind's method to run, and you would just leave out the call of this.inherited. You'll see that a lot if you look through source code, especially things that override the rendered method or create. You need to do some special processing, but you still need the rest of the core framework stuff to run on create, then you use this.inherited. Okay, excuse me. Now that I've got my kind created, I can make a new one. So there's var ff, new Firefly, wait 10 weeks, and then I'm going to delete it. Right? Just like the show. It's funny because I never actually watched Firefly until about a year ago, and I was sitting at home. My wife was out of town, and I wasn't feeling too well, so I fired up Netflix and watched the entire thing in like 2 days. It was a pretty cool show, but oh well, it's gone now. All right, so I think these next few slides just go into a couple of core pieces. At the very base level, we have Enyo.object that provides what we call property publishing. So any Enyo kind that you create, at the very base level, is going to inherit from Enyo objects. So they all have this capability where I have a published property, and it's an object, and the properties of that object become published properties for the kind. Okay, so that means I can later on say what it does is every published property gets an automatic setter or getter method. So there's an automatic set product ID or get product ID method that's generated whenever I create this kind. I can also provide a property changed function, product ID change, to run every time run set and on the value and it changes. And there's the framework is smart to the point where if you run set product ID, but you don't actually change the value from its initial, you set it to the same value, it won't run your product ID change method. You can play around with that whole overriding. You can override the set product ID method and force it to run product ID change every time if that's what you need to do. I've seen that in a couple of places. But in this case, what I'm going to do is if I set the product ID, I'm going to set an internal property called this.barcode. Run some other method called generate for this product ID. This is probably an example here, yes. So I've got this new UPC object, and I'm specifying its product ID when I create it. Right, there it is. And then after I've got my UPC object, I'm going to run set product ID on it, and if I were to then run get product ID, I would be returned my new string, the new value. That's pretty simple stuff. Next up, one more level of complexity beyond object would be Enyo.component. And this is what enables us to encapsulate other components and provides our event system as well. So here's an example. I'm going to make this new kind called a Sith Lord that is extending Jedi. All right. So this is how we do events. Provide an events object, the event that I want to be able to throw whenever. And this is just convention where I'm not telling it what method I want to run. I'm not telling it what handler I want to run on that kind, right? I'll do that later when I include this kind somewhere else, and I'm actually listening for that event. I'll tell it what handler to But here's where I fire the event. So I have this screen function, and anytime I call it, it's going to say do speak. Right, well, the event is on speak. And this is convention. All of our events should be on something, and then whenever we want to fire it, we do that something. Right? And then I pass it the event object that I wanted to send up to the handler. And here's an example of encapsulation. So I have that SWAT kind. Now I'm going to make a container of multiple ones. SWAT is its own kind. And notice I'm not telling it what superkind I'm extending. The default normally would be a control, Enyo.control, something that renders into the DOM. But I think that in this case, since these are components, and I haven't told it where I'm rendering, that this is actually going to end up being an Enyo.component. I've seen that a few times. But the point is, I've got this kind, I provide a components array. These are the components that it owns. All right, so SWAT is going to own these three SWAT kinds. I've got one Darth Vader, Palpatine, Darth Sidious, but I'm only listening to OnSpeak for Darth Vader. Now they all have the OnSpeak method, right? But I'm only going to listen to it for this particular one. And whenever I catch it, I'm going to run the listen to toys function method. And it's going to tell me who sent it, and then this is going to be my event object that I sent up with that do speak method that you saw on the other slide. In that case, it's just going to alert whatever I sent up. There's an example of wielding that. I'm going to make a new variable toys of the SWAT object. So they're all going to, this toys variable is going to contain those three kinds, those three SWAT components that were in the SWAT's kind. All right, and I can access the components that are owned by a particular component by accessing its, we call this the dollar hash. All right, so I haven't shown an example yet of internal to a kind, but this is how you access components that are owned by a particular component. Toys.dollar.darthvader is my reference to the Vader variable. And then after I've got it set, we'll assume he's got properties of set weapon or a weapon property. Once I've set it, do this little throw thing, and then scream, no! Excuse me, then it would alert my string no into my browser window. All right, next up from the end complexity would be Enyo.UI component. This just extends component, and it's an abstract class, right? It's what is the basis for Enyo.control, something that renders into the DOM. You typically don't extend UI component directly, though some people are doing that. I'm seeing in the forums they have special use cases, but it's there for you to hack around on if you need to. Most of the time you can just use Enyo.control and it'll render a regular node in the DOM. All right, Enyo signals. This is a special event handling system for app level events or things, events that aren't associated with DOM nodes, right? You want to use this Enyo signals thing. Let's see if we've got a good example in here. Nope. So Enyo.signals, you basically, if you need to listen to app-wide events or things that aren't attached to the DOM nodes, whatever component you want to do that in, you include this Enyo.signals kind, and you, just like the example here, I would have kind Enyo.signals, and whatever events I wanted to listen for, and I could have multiple ones, right, separated by commas. Okay, and anytime that event fires, any components that have Enyo signals listening for it will run their handlers. Now I can also force the Enyo signals method to fire to all the signals components or signals enabled component, because we have a static method on Enyo.signals, which is Enyo.signalSend. We just send the method and manually make everybody fire. If you go and you look at the wiki docs on event handling, you'll see a little note in there about don't abuse signals. So I don't know if I'm actually abusing it in the app I'm working on. I'll probably get with the lead architect and say, is this an example of abuse or not? So I can point that out a little bit better. All right, so So those are two different ways to handle events. The standard Enyo event model, just by specifying the events block, or you can use Enyo.signals as well. These are other pieces of the core. I'm not going to read them all, but these are, extra pieces for you to, develop your app. Important PhoneGap stuff to be able to do app events from PhoneGap. That's a good one. We have some minimal platform detection code, so you can tell what platform you're running on. Sometimes you'll find that, like on IE8, it may not do everything that all the other browsers will do, and you might need to do some special processing and know which one you're on.
Quick question.
Sure.
On the signals, can you namespace those? Like, let's say I want, I don't know, something like Flickr or something that only happen on a certain group of components, but anytime a vanilla click event occurs, I want to to, or would I have to just create a new signal for those specific?
Well, I'm not sure if you can namespace the events to signals that way. I think you might want to do that. I mean, it might be easier to do like a custom click event that, just that one event, and maybe extend the Enyo control or something to just have that event and use those in those few spots. But if it's all the way through your app, you might need to figure out a different way to implement that. But Kevin, did you have a...
Yeah, so kind of standard Enyo eventing works by components that you've included in your view, say a button or a slider or something. The events that they emit will bubble up through the ownership hierarchy. So on SIP lords, we had like 3 different SIP lords inside of there. So any events that they fire will bubble to their owner, and if they're caught there, they'll be handled there. If not, they'll continue bubbling up. So something like a tap event would typically be handled by kind of the view controller code that's attached to that view. So signals is really for when you kind of want to broadcast globally to any kind living anywhere in your application. So they're used more infrequently than the typical Enyo event bubbling. Right? So for that, you can certainly namespace it however you want. So the signals are just defined by strings.
Thanks, Kevin. All right, so that was kind of some core, or the boot pieces of core. Now we'll look at some DOM stuff. I already told you about Enyo.UI component is an abstract class that does layout. Well, Enyo.control extends UI component. This is something that actually renders a node into the DOM. All right. So here's an example where I'm creating a kind bumper sticker. Remember what I said, if you don't include the kind that you're extending, most of the time by default it's going to be Enyo.control. I was just getting in the habit of telling it what kind I'm extending anyway. It's just one more line, about 16 characters. I can tell it what tag I want it to have. If I don't tell it what tag, it's going to be a div by default. I can make it be a span or BR or whatever it is that I need. I specify with the tag property. In this case, I'm just specifying content, and that will just go in the inner HTML of this particular div. And then I can do inline style this way just by providing a style property and giving it my style string. That's a bug. I need to have a semicolon there at the end. And then there's an example of making it and actually getting it in the DOM. So I make a new bumper sticker, and then there are a couple of ways to do this. Controls have a render into method that I pass an element to, and it will just replace the entire HTML contents of that element with this. Okay? So a lot of times you'll see document.body, render into document.body, take over the whole viewport. But you don't have to do that. You can render this into any element that you have a reference to. So in a very advanced case, you can actually have an entire app running, just render it into an existing div on an already existing web app or something like that, and that works just fine. There's also the write method. So I can do bs.write, and it will just write it inline. So if I'm doing this Enyo code directly in like a script node or something, I can just write it inline right there. Dispatcher.js hooks all our standard DOM events into the Enyo event system so that we can pick up with the Enyo event system, the standard DOM events. So I showed you on speak or whatever it was, yeah, on speak event for the Sith Lord. Well, I could also listen to on tap, which picks up the click events from clicking on a particular div or something. If I say on tap, I'm actually getting the on click DOM event. We use on tap as more of a generic thing because we're doing desktop browsers and mobile devices, so that's a special one. But other things like for the desktop, on mouse over, stuff like that, you could include just like you would the regular Enyo event on your kind. We have Ajax. It's a good thing to have for web-based apps. We do standard XHR or JSON-P stuff. I probably need to update this slide a little bit, perhaps. When we first released Enyo 2, you had to drive all your Ajax this way, right? Make a new Ajax object, give it a URL property, and then tell it what handlers you want to run for response or error, and then say go and pass it your object that will turn into a query string, right? We also now have, due to popular demand, the Enyo.WebService kind, which was one that we had in Enyo 1, which is just kind of a wrapper around the whole Ajax object. So whatever way you're comfortable with, if you like driving it like this, fine. If not, you can create a kind in Enyo.WebService, and then you can tell it the URL property, and on response and on error, run these handlers, and they'll do the same thing. All right, let's see. UI is another piece. So UI provides the basic things that you would imagine in any kind of web app: button, checkbox, image, input, repeater. Repeater is kind of interesting. It basically takes the control that you pass it and just repeats it over and over and over again. Select, excuse me. Touch is where we get our scroller and touchscreen support. Enyo Scroller was a long worked on piece of the framework because some platforms have really bad scrolling performance, and we wanted to make sure that scrolling was smooth and nice on all the platforms that we support. So they spent a lot of time with the scroller, and I think we've pulled down our table for today, but if y'all are here tomorrow, you come by and see the sample app running on all these different devices, and you can see how the scroller works yourself, or try out the various other pieces of the sampler. Also, if you want to check it out today, you can go to enyojs.com/sampler, and it'll just run in the browser the same way. Let's see, what else? Okay, so that was all what's included in the core, right? Now we'll get into an extra piece called layout library. It gives us a few things. We have a couple of responsive kinds. My favorite one is called panels. The sampler app I just mentioned is all written in panels. It's really cool because you're on a tablet, excuse me, or a wide viewport, you get this multiple panel thing, but as soon as you get to a smaller viewport, like less than 800 pixels, or you go into portrait mode on your tablet, or you're looking on a phone, the panels it switches to a single panel view that's swipeable and brings those other panels in or out, right, without you having to change any code at all. That's my favorite one. I can show you that here. These are old screenshots of some of the layout samples of some fittable things. So basically we have two fittable types. One's for fittable rows and one's fittable columns. Right? So you can make any kind of combination of these fittable rows and fittable columns to get the layout that you need. All right, list is in the layout library. Optimize scrolling through lots and lots and lots of items. This may have changed, but I remember early on one of the list samples by default had a count that was like 2 million items or something. And you could just sit there and keep scrolling from 0 to 2 million without it ever hiccuping at all. It's really cool. List is a couple of different things you need to think about for lists. If you're going to have a whole lot of data, you need to kind of keep controls to being simpler. And if you need to do some complex controls, then you might want to use the repeater that I was talking about, because it has a little different way that it's rendering these things. But we hash that out in discussion on the forums all the time. So if anybody has any problems with lists, just come and talk to us. There's an example of list with some more complex controls, and then just kind of like a contact example. Panels I just kind of talked about already. So there's you know, on a slide it's really hard to show how cool this thing is, but anyway, in the sample we've got, and there are more arrangers now too, but we've got the panels sample that we can play with. The arrangers just kind of specify how these things interact, right? A card arranger is typically just going to be one panel per area, like it would just be the 3D panel in this whole space, and if I swipe it, it'll go forward or two, depending on which way I go. The card sliding arranger gives a little cool sliding effect. Carousels, a carousel, and you can turn wrap on, and it will be an infinite carousel. I think in the sample right now, there are probably at least a couple more arrangers shown. You definitely need to update the screenshots. Tree. It's funny, we call it tree, but it's actually, the kind is node. So it's Enyo.node. But again, it's just a simple little tree view. You can tell it what icons you want to use, and they'll just contain other nodes that are expandable or not. If you set the properties correctly, you can make them expand or not. All right, so that was core, then layout, and then another additional piece that we provide is the Onyx widget library. So the comparison would be if Enyo is jQuery, meaning it's very useful by itself without anything else, then Onyx is jQuery UI. Right? So you've seen a couple of things on the sample screenshots, but basically the Onyx widget set are CSS, JavaScript code, and to make these composite controls that are our Onyx widget library. So here's some examples of like these little buttons here, a slider button thing, a slider, the blue box, all of this, the header, they're all part of the Onyx set. And there they all are. There are more actually than this list, I think, now. But as you can see, we've got a pretty good set of widgets that developers can use right now to create compelling apps. I'm not going to read them all to you. Samples. All right, so is Onyx sampler still separate? All right, so disregard this. You can just say enyojs.com/sampler by itself. So I'll fix that. And the sampler itself has an entire Onyx section, so you can go and look at all of the Onyx widgets separately. Same thing, all of these are going to be in the sampler now, not as separate pieces. So you'll find the Flickr search list. It's basically, give it a search string, it'll give you some amount of list items, and then you can scroll through them all, and there'll be a more button at the bottom to have it load more, so you can see some on-demand list loading. Bing Maps, is that one in the sampler?
It's not in the sampler. That link should still work. Okay,
so this one is still standalone. So basically just a kind that we wrapped around Bing Maps. Right? Just drop it in as an Enyo control and you're ready to go. API viewer is pretty cool. We have this running at the enyojs.com/API URL, and it basically just reads all of the source code, excuse me, in line and displays it in a nice little document format. Very handy for when you're developing in Enyo. Crypto tweet, I can show you all that one. This was one that Ben wrote, which basically may not be working anymore because I think Twitter has changed the search API. He was talking about it a little bit when we were in Dallas a few weeks ago. It was working then, sort of kind of was building it from scratch to show some people, but basically it's just an example of how he used Enyo.signals for all of these. It's basically a cryptogram game. And it goes out to either USA Today to pull a news headline or a random Twitter search, which is sometimes dangerous, and then encrypts it, and then it's you guess what the letters are. And so he used Enyo signals to say, if I guess the D is actually E, I need to make sure all the D's, match. So you can take a look at the source code there. We also have a community gallery at /gallery. And what this is, right now there's 60 plus contributed components that you can use in your apps right now. So we're embracing the open source community. We want people to contribute back and give us really cool stuff that we can put in our gallery for other developers to use. Most of the things that you'll find in there will be controls, stuff that renders in the DOM. But there are a couple of back-end type things too, like local storage wrapper. Before we came out with our own version of Enyo.web service, somebody had already written a web service wrapper that's at the gallery as well. But like I said, most of them are going to be controls, spinners and things like that. What else do we have with the community? We have our developer forums, forums.enyojs.com. The blog at blog.enyojs.com. We're on Twitter as EnyoJS. Lots of us are monitoring that. We don't all necessarily have access to write from it, but we all look at it. And then a generic email for questions at enyojs@palm.com. GitHub I mentioned multiple times. It's really easy to find our stuff, github.com/enyojs. Definitely fork it, modify, hack on it. If you fix something, great, let us know, contribute it back. We like that stuff. Definitely go check out the forums. That's getting a little more action lately. The more events that we do, the more people seem to like Enyo. It's a good thing. Oh, that's an old slide. We have a hackathon August 4th. This is not old. We are hiring. You can either email us at enyojs@palm.com, or we have a URL that redirects to the HP stuff. It's called WebOSjobs.com. Should be simple to remember.
For Enyo jobs specifically, you can just go to enyojs.com and there's a jobs link on the bottom.
Okay, that one too. For Enyo specifically, enyojs.com, like Gray said, there's a jobs link. So check that out if you're interested in working on a super cool JavaScript framework. We like it a lot. And that's probably it. I go like really fast. I like kind of fast. That's okay. So you can go with the questions, or I can show you all some stuff. Let's take a look at the sampler. So there's that sample app I was talking about. Let's go to the layout of the panel one. All right, so we got these panels over here, these little fading card arranger things. If I resize my browser down to like a phone size, you can see that that panel just kind of disappears. Now I can drag this over here, right? Your code would detect, hey, on screen resize, and my width is this, maybe I need to go ahead and focus that panel instead of relying on the user to drag it over. But either way, it's, like I said, it's my favorite of our responsive layout kinds for sure. And you can tell that, again, that app is actually written in it. We've got some more stuff on the fittable layouts to show you how things fit, horizontally, vertically. I encourage you to check this sampler app out, at your leisure. There are some great code examples in there. There's also, we have in the core part a playground where you can do some code editing and then have it actually render over here, so you can kind of practice or play around and see what you can do with 4 samples in there already. But also a really cool thing that's happened here in the last month or so, maybe a little bit longer than that, is Jsfiddle now includes the Enyo library, so that you can just use Jsfiddle to test things out or help people work on a problem or something like that. So that's pretty cool. And I guess that's really all I have. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to take them. And if not, if you've signed up for the Enyo After Dark after party, we'll be there. You can ask us questions there as well.
Do we have control over like swipe events in terms of direction, like up, down, left, right?
Yes. So
yeah, so one thing that the framework provides is a normalized set of events. So kind of on touch devices, you would get touch events. On desktop devices, devices, you would get mouse events. So we normalize those all into a set of events that work cross-platform. So one of those, for example, you'll get move or drag events, and I believe there's horizontal or vertical swipe detection. That's a property on that event that you can use. So that's regardless of what context you're running it in, you'll get these normalized events that happen.
Can you share a little bit of how you create your own custom widget?
Let's see.
If you want to, you can go to the main Enyo JS website and do that animated walkthrough of the kind definition. That's probably.
Oh yeah.
It's just the about page.
Oh, okay. There we go. So I haven't even seen this yet. This is cool. All right. So just a little video. So if I click this button, will it do it?
Yeah. So let it.
Oh, sorry.
You can let it play out.
There we go.
Yeah.
That might be hard to read.
Command plus. Yep. So what this example is doing is it's basically creating a sort of a composed widget from two existing widgets. So it's just taking a piece of text and a button and putting them together along with a tap handler. So if you tap the button, in just a sec, it's going to make a change to the style of the text. And so that's defined as a kind called the hello widget. And once you've created that, you can take that, it's an encapsulated piece of functionality, and put one or more instances of that in your application. So in this case, you'll see we're going to put 2 copies of that hello widget in the app, and each one will respond to taps on its own button and style its own label, because each of these components is sort of logically encapsulated piece of UI code. So now if you go to view the result, you'll see we get those 2 widgets, and if you click on either one of those buttons, you'll see the style of the corresponding label gets changed.
So I see the style is very JavaScript centric.
Yes.
What if I want a HTML template?
Yeah.
So we talked about that a little bit. I'm definitely not an expert in how it's working. I've looked at a templating engine, what's it called, Mustache with Ember, right? And I was having difficulties, but I think it was because I may have been trying to render my kinds in the wrong order.
So in certain cases, where if you want to use HTML templates, it's pretty trivial to create an Enyo kind, which basically you integrate with we actually have a simple templating system built into Enyo called Enyo Macroize, but I've actually wrapped Mustache in an Enyo control. It's trivial to do. It's not something that you would necessarily do extensively, because one of the core principles of Enyo is that you very quickly move away from dealing with sort of individual HTML elements and working with sort of a higher level of abstraction. So you're working with sliders and checkboxes and buttons and panels and things, as opposed to sort of doing template-based markup for everything. And one of the advantages of that is, for example, when you have a complex widget that depends on some fairly advanced CSS and JavaScript techniques to make it perform well across different platforms, all of that can be encapsulated in a reusable widget, whereas if you're using an application framework that at the end of the day is just sort of filling templates, each application developer needs to know how to apply all the CSS and JavaScript techniques in order to make that template really come to life. Whereas with Enyo, the best practice is really to build these reusable components. That said, there are definitely times when it's most efficient to basically take an HTML template, populate it with some variables, and then include that in the context of high-level widgets, and it's pretty straightforward to do that.
Do you have dynamic updating like with Ember, where you say grab a list from the server and then something on the server changes? That's all in this, maybe?
Yeah. So the best way today to get that sort of client-server interaction and data binding and data syncing is to actually pair Enyo with Backbone.js, because Backbone actually has a very nice event system which can be hooked up to Enyo's event system. We are actually, for a not too distant future release, working on sort of data binding within Enyo itself, as well as sort of a fully realized MVC pattern that can be used, within Enyo. But right now, we actually have a number of developers who successfully use Backbone plus Enyo to achieve, the type of scenario that you're talking about.
Cool. Anybody else?